The morning sun had barely risen over the English Channel when Luftwaffe pilot Hans Schmidt checked his fuel gauge one more time. 2 hours. That's all he had. 2 hours to fly from his base in France, engage American bombers over Germany, and make it back before his Messerschmitt fell from the sky like a stone. He'd lost 3 friends last month who miscalculated their fuel and never made it home. Across the channel, American pilot Tom Bradley was climbing into his P-51 Mustang, checking the same gauge. 8 hours. He could fly to Berlin, engage enemy fighters, escort bombers deep into Germany, and still have enough fuel to make it back to England with reserves to spare. He didn't think much about it. It was just how things were. But this difference, this seemingly simple matter of fuel capacity, would determine who controlled the skies over Europe, and the Germans would never figure out why they were losing. In early 1943, the Luftwaffe was still one of the most formidable air forces in the world. Their fighters were fast, heavily armed, and piloted by experienced combat veterans. When American B-17 bombers began their daylight raids over Germany, German commanders were confident they could stop them. The mathematics seemed simple. American bombers would have to fly hundreds of miles into German territory without fighter protection because no fighter plane in existence could fly that far and still have fuel to fight and return home. They were right. At first, the early American bombing raids were massacres. Without fighter escorts, B-17s were sitting ducks for German fighters. On October 14, 1943, during a raid on Schweinfurt, the Americans lost 60 bombers in a single day. 600 men killed or captured. The German pilots celebrated. At this rate, they thought, the Americans would run out of planes and crews before Germany ran out of bullets. Oberst Friedrich Weber, a decorated Luftwaffe commander, wrote in his report that night, "The Americans are brave but foolish. They send their bombers without escorts deep into the Chiedemilmark Reich. We shoot them down like clay pigeons. This cannot continue for them. They will be forced to stop the daylight raids within months." He was wrong. But he wouldn't understand why until it was too late. The problem wasn't courage or tactics or even the quality of aircraft. It was fuel. Every fighter plane in 1943 faced the same limitation. You could only carry so much fuel before the weight made the plane too heavy to be effective in combat. German Messerschmitt Bf-109s could fly for about 90 minutes before needing to refuel. Their Focke-Wulf 190s, maybe 2 hours if the pilot was conservative with his throttle. This meant German fighters could protect their own territory, but they couldn't chase them. Every air force in the world accepted this as an unchangeable fact of physics and engineering. You simply couldn't build a long-range fighter that could also dogfight effectively. It was impossible. Except it wasn't. In a nondescript factory in California, North American aviation had been working on a problem that seemed unsolvable. The British had asked them to design a fighter that could escort bombers all the way to Germany and back. The engineers said it couldn't be done. The laws of physics wouldn't allow it. Plane heavy enough to carry that much fuel would be too slow and unmaneuverable to fight German interceptors. But then someone asked a different question. What if the fuel itself weighed less? It sounds absurd now, but this simple question changed everything. The engineers realized they'd been thinking about the problem backwards. Instead of building a bigger plane to carry more fuel, they needed to make the fuel they carried go further. They needed efficiency. The P-51 Mustang that resulted from this thinking was a marvel of aerodynamic engineering. Its laminar flow wings created less drag than any fighter plane in existence. Its Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was a masterpiece of fuel efficiency, extracting maximum power from every drop of gasoline. And critically, it was designed from the beginning to carry external drop tanks, additional fuel containers that could be jettisoned when empty or when combat began. With drop tanks attached, a P-51 could carry 269 gallons of fuel. For comparison, a German Bf-109 carried 88 gallons internally. The mathematics were staggering. The Mustang could fly for 8 hours. 8 hours. It could escort bombers from England to Berlin and back with fuel to spare. But here's what made it devastating. Those drop tanks meant the P-51 could fly deep into Germany with the weight of extra fuel, then drop the empty tanks before engaging in combat, making it as light and maneuverable as any fighter in the sky. The Germans had no equivalent technology. Their external fuel tanks were crude, unreliable, and rarely used in combat operations. Hans Schmidt first encountered P-51s in March 1944. He was leading his squadron to intercept American bombers near Brunswick, deep inside Germany territory that should have been safe from Allied fighters. His flight time from base, 45 minutes. That gave him maybe an hour of combat time before he'd need to turn back or risk running out of fuel over enemy territory. Then he saw them. American fighters. Hundreds of miles from their bases in England. It was impossible. There was no fighter plane in the world that could fly this far. He checked his instruments, thinking perhaps he'd miscalculated his position. But no, he was where he thought he was, deep in the heart of Germany. The engagement lasted 12 minutes. Schmidt managed to damage one bomber before two Mustangs came screaming down from above. He tried to run, but they stayed with him. For 20 minutes they pursued him, easily matching every maneuver. His fuel gauge was screaming at him. He had to break off, had to run for home, or he'd never make it back. As he dove away, desperately trying to conserve fuel, he watched the American fighters simply turn around and fly back to resume escorting their bombers. They weren't low on fuel. They weren't worried. They had hours of flight time remaining. That night, Schmidt sat in the debriefing room with 11 other pilots, all telling the same impossible story. American fighters over Brunswick, over Berlin, over Munich, everywhere. The intelligence officer didn't believe them at first. He pulled out the maps, did the calculations. No fighter could fly that far. The pilots must be mistaken, confused, perhaps seeing things. But the reports kept coming. Every day, more sightings. American fighters ranging freely over all of Germany, engaging the Luftwaffe wherever they found them, then flying home as if it were nothing. German engineers examined captured P-51s and were stunned. The aerodynamic efficiency was beyond anything they'd achieved. The fuel consumption rates were impossibly low. The drop tank system was elegantly simple yet something German designers had never effectively implemented. They wrote reports. They made recommendations. But by 1944, Germany's industrial capacity was stretched beyond breaking. They were running out of fuel, running out of pilots, running out of time. They couldn't redesign their entire fighter fleet even if they wanted to. Oberst Weber flew his last mission in July 1944. He took off from an airfield near Paris with enough fuel for 90 minutes of flight time. He encountered American P-51s 30 minutes from his base. The engagement lasted 8 minutes before his fuel warning light came on. He had to run, again, always running, always watching the fuel gauge, always calculating whether he'd make it back. The American pilots chased him for 15 minutes, then simply let him go. They had fuel to spare. They had time. They could have pursued him all the way back to his base if they wanted. But they didn't need to. They'd already won. Weber made it back with his fuel gauge reading empty, his engine sputtering as he touched down. He climbed out of his Messerschmitt and stood on the tarmac, watching American bombers fly overhead in broad daylight, escorted by swarms of fighters that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist, but did. That's when he understood. Germany hadn't lost because of inferior pilots or tactics or even aircraft quality. They'd lost because of something so mundane, so basic, that no one had thought it could be decisive: fuel efficiency. The Americans could simply stay in the air longer. They could fly further, fight longer, and still make it home. The Luftwaffe was fighting a war where every mission was a desperate race against an empty tank, while the Americans flew with abundance. By late 1944, the statistics were undeniable. American fighters were achieving kill ratios of 5-to-1, sometimes 10-to-1 against the Luftwaffe. Not because they were better plainsmen. German fighters were actually superior in terms of speed or armament, but because the Americans could be everywhere, all the time, while German pilots were constantly calculating fuel, constantly worried about making it home, constantly forced to break off engagements, not because they were losing, but because their tanks were empty. The psychological impact was crushing. German pilots knew that every time they engaged American fighters over Germany, the Americans had more fuel than they did. If the fight went badly, the Americans could pursue. If it went well, the Germans still had to run for home before their fuel ran out. They were fighting with a timer constantly running down, while their enemies fought without that constraint. Tom Bradley flew 73 combat missions in his P-51. He escorted bombers to Berlin 32 times. He engaged German fighters over a dozen German cities. He never once ran out of fuel. He never once had to break off an engagement because his tank was low. The fuel gauge was just another instrument on his panel, something he glanced at occasionally but never worried about. After the war, Bradley met Hans Schmidt at a veterans reunion in 1987. They compared their experiences, their aircraft, their missions. Schmidt finally asked the question that had haunted him for 40 years. How did you do it? How did you fly so far? Bradley looked confused. What do you mean? We just flew. But the fuel? How did you carry enough fuel? Bradley shrugged. The Mustang was just efficient, I guess. We had drop tanks for the long missions. Didn't you? Schmidt laughed bitterly. We had 2 hours. You had 8. That was the war right there. Everything else was just details. He was right. The decisive factor in the air war over Europe wasn't armor, or guns, or speed, or even courage. It was time. The Americans could stay in the air 4 times longer than their German counterparts, and that advantage compounded into total air superiority. By 1945, the Luftwaffe had essentially ceased to exist as an effective fighting force, not because they ran out of planes or pilots, but because they couldn't keep their fighters in the air long enough to matter. The one thing Germany never figured out was that modern warfare wasn't just about building weapons. It was about building weapons that could sustain operations. A mediocre fighter that could fly for 8 hours was infinitely more valuable than a superior fighter that could only fly for 2. The Americans understood this. The Germans didn't, and that simple difference in understanding decided who would control the skies and ultimately who would win the war.